This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to an exploration of one of evolutionary biology's most pivotal ideas. For a long time, we pictured evolution as a slow, continuous climb. But what if the true story of life's change is more dynamic, characterized by long stretches of stability suddenly interrupted by rapid bursts of transformation? Join us as we delve into Punctuated Equilibrium, a groundbreaking theory that challenged traditional views and forever changed how we interpret the fossil record and the very rhythm of life on Earth. Chapter 1. Punctuated Equilibrium, a revolutionary challenge. For generations, the scientific understanding of how life on Earth changed through time was largely shaped by a single powerful image, a slow, steady, continuous march of progress. This idea, often called phyletic gradualism, envisioned species transforming little by little, accumulating tiny changes over immense spans of geological time, much like a river slowly carving a canyon. It was a compelling vision, one that permeated biological thought for over a century, suggesting that if we could only find a complete enough fossil record, we would see an unbroken chain of intermediate forms, seamlessly linking ancestral species to their descendants. This traditional view, while elegant, faced a persistent, nagging problem: the fossil record itself. Despite dedicated searching and accumulating vast collections of ancient life, paleontologists rarely found the smooth, continuous transitions that phyletic gradualism predicted. Instead, they observed a different, more puzzling pattern. Species would appear abruptly in the fossil record, seemingly fully formed, persist for millions of years with little or no apparent change, and then just as suddenly disappear, often to be replaced by new, distinctly different forms. Charles Darwin himself was keenly aware of this discrepancy, stating in On the Origin of Species, "Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." He attributed these gaps to the extreme imperfection of the geological record, hoping that future discoveries would fill in the missing steps. For decades, this explanation served as the favorite escape for many paleontologists from the embarrassment of a record that seemed to show so little direct evidence of gradual evolution. Yet, even Darwin, in the 4th edition of his seminal work, remarkably anticipated the core tenets of punctuated equilibrium, noting that the periods during which species have undergone modification, though long as measured in years, have probably been short in comparison with the periods during which they retain the same form. This subtle acknowledgement hinted at a flexibility in evolutionary tempo that would later be brought to the forefront. But in 1972, a groundbreaking paper by paleontologists Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould presented a radical reinterpretation of this observation. The paper, Punctuated Equilibria, an alternative to phyletic gradualism, had its origins at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in 1971. Tom Schaft, who organized the meeting, assigned Gould the topic of speciation. Gould, recognizing the novelty of Eldredge's 1971 work on trilobites, invited him to present jointly, noting that Eldredge's paper had presented the only new and interesting ideas. While Gould coined the term punctuated equilibrium and edited the final manuscript, Eldredge is the proper first author, reflecting their collaborative yet distinct contributions to the theory. They didn't see the fossil record as merely incomplete. They argued that the pattern itself, the sudden appearances and long periods of stability, was a true reflection of how evolution often worked. They called their theory punctuated equilibrium, and it launched a revolutionary challenge to the entrenched idea of phyletic gradualism, forever changing how we understand the tempo and mode of evolutionary change. Indeed, Ernst Mayr, a towering figure in evolutionary biology, later explicitly complimented the theory, stating that evolutionary stasis had been unexpected by most evolutionary biologists, and that punctuated equilibrium had a major impact on paleontology and evolutionary biology. Punctuated equilibrium proposed two core interconnected claims that stood in stark contrast to the prevailing gradualistic model. First, it asserted that once a species appears in the fossil record, its population tends to become stable, exhibiting very little evolutionary change throughout most of its geological existence. This state of morphological stability, or lack of significant change, they termed stasis. This persistence of form, despite environmental fluctuations, was a central and often overlooked feature of the fossil record that Eldridge and Gould brought to the forefront. Their second claim addressed how significant evolutionary change does occur. They proposed that it is generally restricted to rare and geologically rapid events of branching speciation, a process known as cladogenesis. Instead of one species slowly transforming into another over vast periods, anagenesis, punctuated equilibrium suggested that a parent species splits into two or more distinct daughter species relatively quickly. These rapid bursts of change, the punctuations, were hypothesized to occur in small, geographically isolated populations, often at the periphery of the parent species' range. Once these new species formed, they would then expand their range and population size, appearing suddenly in the broader fossil record, already morphologically distinct from their ancestors, and subsequently entering their own long period of stasis. Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. The revolutionary nature of punctuated equilibrium lay in its direct confrontation with the implicit assumptions of gradualism. The theory, which Gould and Eldridge later described as a seismic event that generated intense controversies, proposed that evolutionary rates fluctuate dramatically, with long stretches of near-zero change interspersed with intense, rapid episodes. They argued that stasis wasn't merely a gap in the record, but a fundamental evolutionary pattern requiring explanation, and that these rapid shifts were evidence of quick, localized speciation events that were unlikely to be captured in the incomplete sedimentary layers. This shift in perspective was profound. It meant that the gaps in the fossil record were not simply frustrating blanks to be filled, but rather meaningful data points revealing the true episodic nature of evolution. This reinterpretation transformed what was once seen as an embarrassment for evolutionary theory into compelling evidence for a different mode of change. The traditional expectation that paleontologists should find continuous sequences of ancestral and descendant species with every intermediate form was challenged. Instead, the sudden appearance of morphologically distinct new species was precisely what one should expect to see, given the dynamics of speciation in small, isolated populations and the vastness of geological time. Eldridge and Gould didn't just present a theoretical model, they underpinned it with empirical observations from their own research. Their meticulous work revealed patterns of abrupt appearance and long-term stability, providing compelling evidence that the pattern of punctuated equilibrium was not an anomaly, but a recurrent theme in the history of life. The publication of Punctuated Equilibrium ignited a storm of controversy within the scientific community. It challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about the nature of evolutionary change and forced biologists to reevaluate their ideas about species dynamics. The theory suggested that species were not infinitely flexible and continuously responsive to every environmental pressure, but rather robust, stable entities that changed only under specific, often dramatic circumstances. This new perspective underscored the importance of the fossil record not just as a repository of past life, but as a crucial source of information for detecting macroevolutionary phenomena, patterns too vast in scale to be observed by biologists studying living organisms over shorter timescales. This revolutionary challenge paved the way for a deeper, more nuanced understanding of evolution, moving beyond a singular, gradualistic narrative to embrace a more complex, episodic story of life's unfolding. It highlighted that the rate of evolution might be intrinsic to certain groups, rather than solely a direct, continuous response to environmental pressures. And it compelled scientists to look closer at the fossil record, not just for what was missing, but for what was profoundly present and consistent, long periods of stability dramatically interrupted by bursts of transformative change. This reevaluation continues to shape scientific inquiry into the very patterns that define the history of life. The next question, then, is to delve into these unexpected patterns in greater detail, exploring how the fossil record truly speaks to these long periods of stability, or stasis, that punctuated equilibrium so powerfully emphasizes. Chapter 2. Fossils' Silent Story. Stasis Revealed. For many years, the prevailing scientific narrative explained the apparent gaps in the fossil record as mere imperfections, dismissing them as frustrating omissions rather than meaningful data. But what if those stretches where species seemed stubbornly unchanging were not gaps at all, but rather a fundamental, observable pattern of evolution? This radical reinterpretation, championed by the theory of punctuated equilibrium, shifted the focus from what was missing to what was profoundly present: long periods of remarkable evolutionary stability, or stasis. Stasis, in the context of punctuated equilibrium, doesn't imply an absolute, unchanging immutability from one generation to the next. Organisms naturally exhibit variation, and populations can experience minor fluctuations in their characteristics over time. The key, however, is that these generational changes do not accumulate in a directional manner. Instead, a species in stasis wobbles about its phenotypic mean, meaning its average physical traits might shift slightly back and forth, but without any sustained trend towards a new form. This concept is vividly illustrated by the microevolutionary fluctuations observed in the Galapagos finches, as famously documented in Jonathan Weiner's The Beak of the Finch, where beak sizes might vary with environmental conditions but return to a mean over time without directional change. Imagine a pendulum swinging, but always returning to its central position. It moves, but its overall state remains in equilibrium. This is the essence of stasis, a state where, over vast stretches of geological time, the oldest and youngest representatives of a species are virtually indistinguishable. The foundational observations that brought stasis to the forefront came from rigorous paleontological investigations. Niles Eldredge, in his study of Devonian trilobites, a group of ancient marine arthropods, unearthed compelling evidence. He focused on species like Phacops rana, later reclassified as Eldredgeops, which thrived approximately 385 to 380 million years ago in the shallow seaways covering what is now eastern North America. Eldredge meticulously examined the trilobites' morphology, paying particular attention to the number of rows of lenses in their compound eyes. He observed fixed numbers of dorsoventral columns of eye lenses, specifically 18, 17, and 16 to 15, that did not change through successive geological stages spanning 6 to 7 million years. New species within this group appeared relatively abruptly in the fossil record, exhibiting distinct differences in these features. However, once a new Eldredgeops species emerged, its characteristic eye structure, and indeed its overall morphology, remained remarkably consistent. These species persisted for several million years, often through various geological stages, without undergoing any significant net evolutionary change. While some minor variations might be noted within a species across its long history, these fluctuations canceled each other out, resulting in no overall directional modification. The stability was undeniable. Stephen Jay Gould, Eldridge's collaborator, found a strikingly similar pattern in his research on Pleistocene land snails from Bermuda, specifically species belonging to the genus Poecilozonites. These snails, representing a much more recent geological time frame, only a few 100,000 years old, also demonstrated clear instances where new species, distinguished by subtle shell characteristics, appeared, and then maintained their form with little to no alteration for extended periods after their initial emergence. These early, well-documented examples from disparate groups of organisms across different geological eras provided powerful initial support for the widespread reality of stasis. As paleontologists continued to scrutinize the fossil record with this new perspective, more and more examples of enduring stasis came to light, further solidifying its status as a pervasive evolutionary pattern. One of the most astonishing examples is the fern Osmunda claytoniana. Paleontological evidence reveals that this species has remained virtually unchanged, not just morphologically, but even at the level of its fossilized nuclei and chromosomes, for at least 180 million years. To put that into perspective, this fern has persisted through the age of dinosaurs, the rise of mammals, and countless global environmental shifts, maintaining its ancient form with incredible fidelity. It stands as a profound testament to the power of stasis. Even more dramatically, the brachiopod lingula, a marine filter feeder, provides an extreme case of evolutionary conservatism. Darwin himself noted that the Silurian lingula differs but little from the living species of this genus, despite its immense geological age, spanning over 500 million years. This ancient lineage has maintained its distinctive shell and body plan for 500 million years, making it one of the most enduring examples of stasis known. Further studies added to this growing body of evidence. Research on neogene bivalves, for instance, revealed over a dozen species that maintained their distinct morphologies for many millions of years. Species like Dosinia discus and Macrocallista maculata are among those that show this remarkable consistency in form over vast geological durations. Similarly, investigations into neogene bryozoa, colonial marine invertebrates, reiterated the pervasive nature of stasis across numerous lineages. Devonian brachiopods, ancient shelled marine creatures, also provided compelling evidence of morphological stability over millions of years. Even among living species, observations of reproductively isolated but morphologically indistinguishable sibling species of sympatric olive shells, Amalda sp., confirm millions of years of morphological stasis in multiple lineages, with genetic differences accumulating while outward appearance remains constant. Perhaps the most dramatic and widely recognized illustrations of stasis come from living fossils, organisms that have persisted for millions of years with little to no apparent change, often resembling their ancient fossilized ancestors. The coelacanth, a lobe-finned fish, is a prime example. For decades, it was known only from fossils dating back over 400 million years, believed to have gone extinct about 66 million years ago. Then, in 1938, a live coelacanth was discovered off the coast of South Africa, revealing an animal astonishingly similar to its ancient fossil relatives. This discovery profoundly demonstrated that entire lineages could maintain their form over immense stretches of geological time, completely defying the expectation of continuous gradual transformation. The accumulation of these individual case studies eventually paved the way for broader quantitative analyses. Modern meta-analyses, synthesizing findings from dozens of published studies on speciation patterns in the fossil record, have provided a clearer picture of the prevalence of stasis. One such comprehensive review, examining 58 different studies, found that a remarkable 71% of species exhibited stasis. Furthermore, 63% of these were associated with punctuated patterns of evolutionary change. This was a profound and unexpected finding for many in the scientific community, as it directly contradicted the earlier assumption that stasis was rare or insignificant. The sheer frequency of species displaying long-term stability meant that it could no longer be dismissed as an anomaly or an artifact of an imperfect record. It was, quite simply, a dominant pattern in the history of life. Studies employing a persistence of ancestor criterion to distinguish between anagenesis, gradual transformation, and cladogenesis, branching speciation, have overwhelmingly found cladogenesis to be the dominant mode of species origin, with punctuational speciation occurring about 10 times more frequently than gradualistic speciation. While these early quantitative analyses provided powerful initial support for the widespread reality of stasis, the precise prevalence and nature of evolutionary patterns continue to be subjects of ongoing, nuanced statistical investigation. Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. This widespread observation of stasis forced evolutionary biologists to reevaluate their fundamental ideas about species themselves. If species could remain morphologically constant for millions of years, even in the face of changing environments, they couldn't be viewed as infinitely flexible entities, constantly molding themselves to external pressures. Instead, they appeared to be robust, homeostatic entities, possessing an inherent stability that resisted directional change. This recognition highlighted that factors intrinsic to the species, perhaps developmental constraints or stabilizing selection, played a powerful role in maintaining form, even as the world around them shifted. The fossil record, once thought to be a mere fragmented glimpse of gradual change, had revealed a deeper, more complex rhythm to evolution, one where long periods of enduring stability were a central, undeniable feature. This unexpected prominence of stasis, so clearly etched in the ancient rocks, raised a critical question. If species largely persist without significant change for millions of years, how then do fundamentally new forms, new adaptations, and new species ever arise? Chapter 3, Darwin's Shadow and the Punctuated Truth. The introduction of punctuated equilibrium into the scientific discourse challenged long-held assumptions and sparked significant discussion. As with any revolutionary idea, its rapid ascent to prominence inevitably led to a host of misunderstandings and misinterpretations, often fueled by its controversial relationship with Charles Darwin's foundational concepts. To truly grasp the significance of punctuated equilibrium, we must first unpack these common misconceptions and illuminate the nuanced connections and divergences it shares with Darwin's original ideas. Perhaps the most persistent and damaging misconception surrounding punctuated equilibrium is the notion that it proposes saltational evolution, the idea that new species arise through sudden, single-generation jumps, often attributed to hopeful monsters. This interpretation, sometimes linked to earlier, more speculative genetic theories, was enthusiastically seized upon by some critics, and, unfortunately, even by some who wished to discredit evolutionary science entirely. However, proponents of punctuated equilibrium have consistently and forcefully rejected this caricature. When Eldridge and Gould spoke of rapid evolutionary change, they were operating on a geological timescale, not a biological one. A burst of evolution, or a punctuation in their framework, typically spans between 50,000 and 100,000 years. While this is indeed rapid when compared to the millions of years that species often remain in stasis, it is still an immense period in human terms, encompassing countless generations. Within this time frame, evolutionary change still occurs incrementally through the accumulation of small genetic modifications over many generations, driven by natural selection. There are no instantaneous single-step transformations of one species into another.
The confusion often arises from the geological compression of time, where tens of thousands of years can be represented by a single thin layer of sedimentary rock, making the change appear instantaneous in the fossil record. This is why Stephen Jay Gould famously expressed his frustration. Since we proposed punctuated equilibria to explain trends, it is infuriating to be quoted again and again by creationists, whether through design or stupidity, I do not know, as admitting that the fossil record includes no transitional forms. Transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but they are abundant between larger groups.
Another related misunderstanding stems from the humorous yet misleading labels often applied to the two contrasting theories: punctuated equilibrium as evolution by jerks and phyletic gradualism as evolution by creeps. While catchy, these phrases oversimplify the scientific arguments. Punctuated equilibrium at its core is not anti-gradualism in the genetic sense. Even during rapid speciation events, changes are still occurring in small, incremental steps from one generation to the next. The gradualism that punctuated equilibrium contrasted with was a specific interpretation of phyletic gradualism, implying a uniform, constant speed of evolution, what some later termed constant speedism. Punctuated equilibrium, in contrast, proposes a variable speedism, where evolutionary rates fluctuate, with long periods of stability, punctuated by relatively rapid, but still gradual at the genetic level, bursts of change. Richard Dawkins further distinguished this as discrete variable speedism, Eldridge and Gould's view, versus continuously variable speedism, critics who see stasis as merely ultra-slow evolution. To a punctuationist, the crucial distinction lies in the special nature of stasis, seeing it not merely as ultra-slow evolution, but as a distinct state of morphological stability. Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. The scope of punctuated equilibrium also generated confusion. Early critiques, some from eminent figures, suggested that it was little more than a relabeling of George Gaylord Simpson's earlier concept of multi-tempo evolution. Simpson, a highly respected paleontologist, had indeed proposed that evolutionary rates differ across groups and lineages, categorizing them as slow, bradytelic, medium, horotelic, and rapid, tachytelic. He even introduced quantum evolution to describe very rapid evolution leading to new higher taxonomic groups. However, there were key differences. Punctuated equilibrium primarily addressed evolution at the species level, whereas quantum evolution was concerned with the origin of entirely new families, orders, and classes. More significantly, Simpson believed that phyletic gradual evolution, called horotely in his terminology, comprised 90% of evolution, thus downplaying the significance of stasis. He stated, evolutionary change is so nearly the universal rule that a state of motion is, figuratively, normal in evolving populations. The state of rest, as in bradytely, is the exception, and it seems that some restraint or force must be required to maintain it. Eldridge and Gould, on the other hand, elevated stasis to a fundamental pattern, a central pillar of their theory, and linked rapid change directly to ordinary speciation processes, particularly allopatric speciation, rather than the synergistic interaction of genetic drift and adaptive shifts proposed by Simpson for quantum evolution. This brings us to the controversial relationship with Darwin himself. It is often incorrectly assumed that Darwin insisted on a constant, uniform rate of change throughout evolutionary history. This interpretation positions punctuated equilibrium as fundamentally anti-Darwinian. However, a closer look at Darwin's own writings reveals a more nuanced perspective. In the very first edition of On the Origin of Species, Darwin acknowledged that species of different genera and classes have not changed at the same rate or in the same degree. It reveals that Darwin himself, despite his public emphasis on gradualism, recognized the episodic nature of evolutionary change. So, where does the perceived conflict with Darwin arise? It often stems from Darwin's strategic emphasis. Darwin was writing against the prevailing influences of catastrophism and progressive creationism, which posited supernatural creation events. To counter these ideas and align with Charles Lyell's geological gradualism, Darwin needed to forcefully stress the gradual nature of evolution, emphasizing small, incremental steps, genetic gradualism, as the mechanism. This strategic emphasis, while crucial for his argument against sudden creation, was sometimes misinterpreted as a universal claim about the rate of change. Indeed, Darwin privately expressed concern, noting in the margin of his 1844 essay, "Better begin with this. If species really, after catastrophes, created in showers world over, my theory false." This reveals his deep-seated need to establish gradualism as a cornerstone. Another point of divergence concerns the specific mechanisms of speciation. Punctuated equilibrium emphasizes that rapid change can occur in small populations geographically isolated from the main parental stock. Darwin, while acknowledging the importance of isolation in his early thinking, as shown in his essay of 1844, later downplayed its role in On the Origin of Species. He suggested that largeness of area is still more important, especially for the production of species which shall prove capable of enduring for a long period and of spreading widely. He reasoned that large, open areas would offer a greater chance for favorable variations to arise, more complex conditions of life leading to competitive improvement, and wider dispersal for successful new forms. This specific difference regarding the locus of significant evolutionary change, peripheral isolates versus large areas, represents a genuine incongruity between some of Darwin's ideas and the mechanisms initially favored by punctuated equilibrium. Despite these specific differences and the intense controversies, many evolutionary biologists, including prominent figures, maintain that punctuated equilibrium lies firmly within the broader neo-Darwinian synthesis. Richard Dawkins, for instance, described it as an interesting but minor wrinkle on the surface of neo-Darwinian theory, acknowledging its radical aspect in proposing that evolution generally proceeds in bursts or not at all, rather than continuously. He further stated that punctuated equilibrium was oversold by some journalists, partly due to Eldridge and Gould's later writings, and does not deserve a particularly large measure of publicity. The intensity of the debate was such that Robert Trivers accused Gould of being something of an intellectual fraud for using well-known claims to support grandiose ones. English professor Heidi Scott also critiqued Gould's communication style, arguing that his talent for writing vivid prose, his use of metaphor, altered the climate of specialized scientific discourse favorably in his promotion of punctuated equilibrium. The core mechanisms invoked by Eldridge and Gould, natural selection, genetic drift, and reproductive isolation leading to allopatric speciation, are all well-established Darwinian processes. The novelty lay not in proposing entirely new mechanisms, but in reinterpreting their implications for the fossil record and the tempo of evolution at the species level. The theory essentially applied an allopatric speciation model to geological time, concluding that if most evolution happens in rare, localized speciation events, then evidence of gradual evolution in the broad fossil record should indeed be rare. The debate, therefore, was not a rejection of Darwinian evolution, but rather a refinement of its tempo and mode, driven by the accumulating evidence from paleontology. It highlighted that the rate of evolution itself is a complex variable, not a constant. The anti-Darwinian label, often deployed by critics or misinformed commentators, largely misrepresents both Darwin's own flexible views on evolutionary rates and the scientific foundations of punctuated equilibrium. The theory has, in fact, been instrumental in reintegrating paleontology with mainstream evolutionary biology, providing a framework that allows paleontologists to contribute unique insights into macroevolutionary patterns that are too vast and slow to be observed in real time by biologists studying living populations. The lasting legacy of punctuated equilibrium, beyond the initial storm of controversy, is its profound impact on how scientists interpret the fossil record and conceive of species. It transformed the gaps from an embarrassment into meaningful data, compelling a deeper understanding of stasis as a significant evolutionary phenomenon. This reevaluation has paved the way for new lines of inquiry, particularly into the biological and genetic mechanisms that might explain both the enduring stability of species and the rapid bursts of change that punctuate their history. What then are these specific biological mechanisms that underpin such a dynamic and episodic view of life's unfolding?
Chapter 4. Mechanisms of Stasis and Speciation. We've explored how punctuated equilibrium challenged traditional views of gradual evolution, and how the fossil record consistently reveals long periods of species stability. Now it's time to delve into the fundamental question: what are the underlying biological mechanisms that can explain both these prolonged stretches of evolutionary stasis and the seemingly sudden bursts of rapid speciation? This is where the theory truly integrates insights from various biological fields, moving beyond mere observation to a deeper understanding of life's dynamic processes. At the heart of punctuated equilibrium's explanation for rapid evolutionary change, the punctuations, lies the concept of allopatric speciation, particularly its parapatric form, which was famously popularized by Ernst Mayr. As introduced in Chapter 1, this model posits that while extensive gene flow within large central populations acts as a homogenizing force, preventing rapid directional shifts, the story changes dramatically for smaller populations that become geographically isolated. These peripheral isolates, decoupled from broad gene flow and often under intense selective pressure in novel environments, can undergo rapid morphological change due to phenomena like the founder effect. This swift evolution in a limited area explains why evidence of gradual change in the broader fossil record is rare. The actual speciation event happens too quickly and in too limited a geographic area to be widely fossilized. Once these newly formed species expand their range, they appear suddenly in the fossil record, already morphologically distinct. This pattern is evident in the fossil record. For instance, the Devonian trilobites, such as species of Eldrochops, formerly Phacops rana, illustrate new species emerging rapidly in geographically isolated pockets. Similarly, studies on freshwater mollusks from the Tertiary period of Lake Turkana in Kenya have documented episodes of stasis punctuated by rapid change. These bursts of evolution were often linked to severe environmental shifts, such as parts of the lake drying up, which would have created isolated populations under intense selective pressure. Beyond geographic isolation, other biological mechanisms contribute to these rapid evolutionary shifts. One such mechanism is heterochrony, which refers to a change in the rate or timing of developmental events in an organism compared to its ancestors. For instance, a mutation could cause an organism to grow for a much longer period, resulting in a significantly larger adult form. Or it might retain juvenile characteristics into adulthood, a process known as paidomorphosis. These kinds of developmental alterations can lead to substantial morphological changes that appear almost instantaneous in the geological record, creating the punctuations we observe. Modern evolutionary developmental biology, often called evo-devo, has further illuminated how abrupt morphological transitions can occur. Research in this field shows that changes in regulatory genes, which control the activity of other genes during development, can have widespread effects on an organism's body plan. For example, mutations in Hox genes, master control genes that dictate the basic body layout, can lead to dramatic alterations, such as the repositioning of limbs or the development of entirely new structures. These large-scale developmental shifts can drive significant phenotypic changes in relatively short evolutionary timeframes, providing a powerful genetic basis for rapid morphological divergence.
In the microbial world, other fascinating mechanisms contribute to rapid evolution. Horizontal gene transfer, or HGT, allows prokaryotes like bacteria and viruses to exchange genetic material directly, rather than solely through inheritance from parent to offspring. This process can quickly introduce novel genes and traits into a population, leading to swift adaptation. A compelling example is the rapid evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria, where genes conferring resistance can spread like wildfire through bacterial populations via mobile genetic elements, such as plasmids. This allows for incredibly fast evolutionary leaps in response to new selective pressures.
Epigenetic modifications also play a role. These are changes in gene expression that don't involve altering the underlying DNA sequence itself, but rather modifications to how genes are read and used. Such changes, like DNA methylation, can be inherited across generations and contribute to phenotypic variation, allowing organisms to adapt quickly to changing environments without waiting for new mutations to arise and spread. Furthermore, large-scale genetic events like genome duplication, where an entire set of chromosomes is copied, can provide a wealth of raw material for evolutionary innovation. The duplicated genes can then diverge in function over time, leading to the evolution of entirely new traits and adaptations. This is particularly common in plants, where polyploidy, having more than 2 sets of chromosomes, is a known pathway to rapid speciation. Ultimately, environmental shifts often act as critical triggers for these periods of rapid change. Abrupt alterations in climate, habitat availability, or the introduction of new predators or competitors can create intense selective pressures that disrupt the long-standing equilibrium of a species. These stressors favor individuals with novel traits, driving rapid adaptation and speciation. Even catastrophic events like mass extinctions can create immense opportunities for adaptive radiation, as surviving lineages quickly diversify to fill the ecological niches left vacant by extinct species. Now, let's turn our attention to the other side of the coin, the mechanisms that explain evolutionary stasis, the equilibrium phase, where species persist for millions of years with remarkably little change. This phenomenon, once dismissed as an artifact of an incomplete fossil record, is now recognized as a significant evolutionary pattern demanding its own explanation. One of the most straightforward explanations for stasis lies in stabilizing selection. In a stable environment, individuals with traits close to the population average are often the most successful, while those with extreme variations are selected against. This constant pressure acts to maintain existing traits and reduces variation, effectively locking a species into its current form. If a species is already well adapted to its environment, there's simply no strong selective advantage for significant change. As the old adage goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This concept is further reinforced by the homogenizing dynamics of gene flow in large, widespread populations, as discussed earlier. The constant mixing of genes across a vast population can dilute the effect of new mutations, preventing them from reaching fixation, and thus contributing to overall morphological stability. Early in the development of punctuated equilibrium theory, some hypotheses for stasis focused on internal biological constraints, such as genetic homeostasis or developmental homeostasis. These ideas suggested that organisms possess inherent regulatory mechanisms that resist change and maintain a stable collective morphology. However, these specific homeostatic models were largely questioned, with critics arguing that such species-level homeostasis was antithetical to Darwinian natural selection, and that these were theories to explain what cannot be seen and studied. Developmental constraints, in particular, can canalize and restrict the amount and type of morphological change that can occur, contributing to this enduring stability. Another mechanism contributing to stasis is koinophilia, the preference for mates with average traits. This active form of stabilizing selection reduces variation within a population, reinforcing the existing phenotype and resisting directional change. At a broader scale, normalizing clade selection has been proposed as a mechanism for stasis. This refers to selection acting at the level of clades, groups of species, to favor those with lower rates of change or higher stability, effectively selecting for lineages that maintain their form over long periods.
Another compelling explanation for stasis is habitat tracking. If a species is highly specialized to a particular environmental condition, and that condition shifts geographically due to climate change or other factors, the species may simply move with its preferred habitat rather than evolving to adapt to a new one. For instance, if a specific forest type migrates northward as the climate warms, the animals and plants adapted to that forest may follow it, maintaining their morphology rather than evolving new adaptations to live in a different kind of forest. This allows them to persist unchanged over vast stretches of time as long as their preferred habitat remains available somewhere. The Stenseth-Maynard-Smith stability hypothesis also offers an interesting perspective, suggesting that stasis can be a logical outcome of natural selection under certain conditions. They proposed that rapid evolution might occur to reach an optimal adaptive state, and once that state is achieved in a relatively stable environment, further significant change would be unnecessary, leading to long periods of stasis. This implies that stasis is not a lack of evolution, but rather a stable outcome of evolutionary processes, with natural selection actively maintaining the existing form. Even at the most fundamental level, the genetic code itself exhibits a remarkable resistance to change. Most mutations are random, and many are harmful, quickly being eliminated by natural selection. Beneficial mutations that cause significant changes are rare. This inherent conservatism of genetic systems further contributes to the long-term stability observed in species. The evidence for stasis is not just theoretical, it's profoundly empirical, as extensively detailed in Chapter 2. From ancient ferns like Osmunda claytoniana to marine bivalves and brachiopods, the fossil record consistently reveals species maintaining their forms for millions of years. These and other observations, including reproductively isolated but morphologically indistinguishable sibling species, underscore that stasis is not a passive absence of change, but an active, maintained state influenced by a complex interplay of internal and external factors. While stasis is common, a more nuanced understanding suggests that it isn't always a simple static state. Modern analyses indicate that meandering random walks or more complex models often account for the majority of cases, implying that evolutionary trajectories within species can involve non-directional fluctuations around a mean rather than absolute immobility. Understanding these diverse biological mechanisms for both rapid speciation and enduring stasis allows us to appreciate the multifaceted nature of evolution. It shows us that evolution is not a single uniform process, but a complex dance between stability and transformation, driven by a rich array of genetic, developmental, ecological, and environmental factors. These insights have profoundly shaped how we view the history of life, compelling us to consider not just that change occurs, but how and why it proceeds in such a punctuated rhythm. This deeper understanding of the mechanisms behind punctuated equilibrium raises further questions about its broader implications and applications. How have these ideas continued to be debated and refined within the scientific community? And what surprising applications might they have beyond the realm of evolutionary biology itself? Chapter 5. Its Reach, Its Rebuttals. Even decades after its initial proposal, the theory of punctuated equilibrium continues to spark vigorous debate and refinement within scientific circles, a testament to its profound impact and the complex questions it raises about the very nature of change.
While it has reshaped how we interpret the fossil record and understand evolutionary tempo, it has also faced persistent critiques, often rooted in misunderstandings or differing philosophical perspectives on evolutionary processes. Yet, ironically, the very pattern it describes, long periods of stability punctuated by rapid shifts, has proven to be a powerful conceptual lens, finding surprising applications far beyond the realm of biological evolution. One of the most enduring points of contention, often surfacing in public discourse and sometimes even within academic discussions, revolves around the true speed of the punctuations. Despite repeated clarifications, the idea that punctuated equilibrium implies instantaneous single-generation leaps, a form of saltational evolution, persists. This misinterpretation highlights the ongoing challenge of communicating complex scientific concepts across different scales of time and understanding. Another line of criticism, notably articulated by prominent evolutionary biologists, suggests that punctuated equilibrium is not a radical departure, but rather a minor wrinkle on the broader canvas of established evolutionary theory. These critics argue that the core mechanisms invoked, natural selection, genetic drift, and reproductive isolation, are all well within the neo-Darwinian synthesis. From this perspective, punctuated equilibrium merely describes a particular tempo of evolution, one that might be interesting but doesn't fundamentally alter the underlying principles of how evolution works. This view often contends that the theory's prominence, especially among non-specialist audiences, was perhaps amplified by the engaging rhetorical style of its proponents rather than solely by its inherent scientific novelty. However, many paleontologists and evolutionary biologists counter that this perspective undervalues the theory's contribution. They argue that by elevating stasis from an artifact of an incomplete record to a significant evolutionary pattern, and by linking rapid change directly to speciation events, punctuated equilibrium profoundly shifted the focus of inquiry. It provided a robust framework for understanding macroevolutionary patterns that are simply too vast in scale to be observed in real time. The empirical evidence itself continues to fuel ongoing debates regarding the prevalence of stasis and the nature of punctuational change. More recent rigorous statistical analyses offer a nuanced picture. These sophisticated tests, comparing models of stasis, random walks, and directional trends, indicate that while stasis is commonly observed, it is not always the dominant pattern. Instead, meandering random walks or more complex models often account for a greater number of cases, suggesting that evolutionary trajectories within species can be more varied than a simple stasis or punctuational dichotomy. Furthermore, the second core claim of punctuated equilibrium, that morphological change is predominantly concentrated in pulses associated with speciation, has received comparatively less empirical scrutiny. While theoretical models support the plausibility of such speciational pulses, integrating ancestor-descendant time series into a phylogenetic framework to confidently assess their frequency and importance relative to gradual changes within lineages remains a challenge for paleontologists. This ongoing work highlights that punctuated equilibrium is not a settled dogma, but a dynamic and evolving area of research, continually tested and refined by new data and analytical methods. In some cases, the observed patterns are even described as punctuated gradualism, a hybrid process that acknowledges both periods of stasis and occasional rapid but still directional evolutionary shifts. Beyond the specific arguments about its biological mechanisms or prevalence, the very pattern of punctuated equilibrium, long periods of stability interrupted by short bursts of intense change, has proven remarkably insightful when applied to complex systems outside of biology. This is perhaps one of its most surprising and far-reaching legacies. One of the most prominent applications has emerged in the study of social theory and public policy making.
Researchers observed that public policies often behave like evolving species, characterized by long periods of stability punctuated by short periods of radical change. This conceptual framework, drawing directly from the biological theory, helps explain why governments sometimes seem resistant to change, making only minor adjustments, while at other times they are receptive to evidence and discussion that leads to significant policy shifts. For instance, consider the history of tobacco policy in some nations. For many years, policy remained relatively stable, with limited regulation. However, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, following a landmark public health report, there was a radical and rapid shift in policy, introducing new regulations and public awareness campaigns. This burst of change was then followed by another extended period of relative stability. Similar patterns have been observed in environmental, energy, and gun control policies, where issues can remain off the macro-political agenda for decades, handled incrementally within specialized subsystems, only to erupt into widespread attention and rapid transformation following a critical event or a successful effort to redefine the issue. This punctuated equilibrium theory in social science posits that political systems, much like biological organisms, operate under bounded rationality. Policymakers with limited attention spans cannot simultaneously consider all issues. They ignore most and focus intensely on a few. This disproportionate information processing leads to long periods of minimal change, or hyper-incrementalism, interspersed with punctuations when external pressures reach a tipping point, causing a surge of attention and self-reinforcing change. This framework has been applied not only to national governments, but also to international organizations and the dynamics of small work groups, where teams often exhibit initial inertia, a midpoint transition driven by looming deadlines, and a final surge of activity. The pattern has also found its way into linguistics, suggesting that language change itself might follow a punctuated rhythm. While a traditional view might see languages evolving slowly and continuously, some linguists have proposed models where language histories exhibit periods of stability interspersed with rapid bursts of change. Recent computational phylogenetic methods have provided empirical backing for this idea, showing that punctuational bursts play a significant role when languages split from one another. These bursts can account for a substantial portion, anywhere from 10% to 33% of the total divergence in vocabulary between related languages, and about 24% of divergence among cognates in families like Indo-European. This suggests that the evolution of communication systems, like biological ones, might proceed in an episodic fashion. Even more broadly, punctuated evolution has been argued to explain changes in folk tales and mythology over time, where narratives and cultural elements might remain stable for generations before undergoing periods of rapid transformation in response to social or environmental shifts. In the realm of technological and surgical innovation, the analogy holds striking relevance. The history of medicine, for instance, can be viewed as periods of relative quietude mixed with dramatic bursts of innovation. Consider the 19th century, when the discovery of ether as an anesthetic and the use of carbolic acid for antisepsis fundamentally transformed surgery, leading to a rapid shift in practice. In more recent times, the field of urology witnessed a swift transition from large invasive flank incisions for ureteral stones to the adoption of shockwave lithotripsy and ureteroscopy within just 5 years, effectively making older practices obsolete. Similarly, in oncology, periods of stagnation in chemotherapy were punctuated by the rapid proliferation of novel immunotherapy agents, like checkpoint inhibitors, offering entirely new treatment paradigms for various cancers. Today, surgery itself is experiencing another such punctuation, with rapid advancements in automation, artificial intelligence, and minimally invasive techniques. Finally, the philosophical study of scientific change itself has employed punctuated equilibrium as a powerful metaphor. Researchers have modeled scientific theories as complex Bayesian networks, where propositions and their connections evolve over time in response to a continuous barrage of random incoming evidence. Intriguingly, these models reveal robust patterns of change that strongly resemble punctuated equilibrium. They suggest that scientific progress often involves long periods of normal science, where existing paradigms are refined incrementally, interspersed with paradigm shifts, sudden, radical reorganizations of understanding triggered by critical evidence or new interpretations. This application suggests that the very process of knowledge accumulation and theoretical evolution in science mirrors the episodic nature of biological change. These diverse applications highlight that the pattern of punctuated equilibrium is not merely a quirk of fossil records, but a potentially fundamental dynamic of complex systems across various domains. It compels us to recognize that stability is often a dominant state, actively maintained, and that transformative change, while rare, can be profound and rapid when the conditions are right. What other complex systems, from economics to climate, might reveal similar punctuated rhythms if we look closely enough? Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. From challenging the long-held view of phyletic gradualism to elevating stasis as a fundamental evolutionary pattern, punctuated equilibrium has profoundly reshaped our understanding of life's history. It reveals that evolution isn't a slow, continuous march, but a dynamic interplay of long periods of stability, maintained by mechanisms like stabilizing selection, and rapid, geologically brief bursts of speciation, often in isolated populations. This isn't anti-Darwinian, but a powerful refinement, integrating paleontology with modern evolutionary biology. Beyond fossils, this episodic pattern of change, stability interrupted by transformation, offers a powerful lens through which to view everything from social policy to technological innovation. It compels us to see the world not as a constant flow, but as a series of equilibria poised for unexpected and profound punctuations. Thank you for listening.